let us look at the cloud effect. So research had actually shown that the climate model supported the possibility of clouds very likely regulating the melting speed of the sea ice. So here is the image where we have a cloud. So 100% of the solar radiation is coming, that hits the cloud, and then 20% is reflected back, and then only 80% of the solar radiation reaches the ice. And since ice has the highest albedo effect, so 70% of the sunlight is actually reflected back. So this is what happens when there is a cloud. And if it is a clear sky, what happens? 100% of the solar radiation directly hits the ice, and now 90%, because we know between 0.85 to 0.9 is the albedo effect of snow. So around 90% of the solar radiation is reflected back in the sky. But if there is no sea ice, then what will happen is 100% of the solar radiation comes, 20% is reflected by the cloud, then 80% of the solar radiation reaches the water, but water has a very low albedo. That means it absorbs all the amount of sun rays that reaches it. So that means just 5% is only reflected back. So that means this leads to the heating of this water. So this is what actually happens. And similarly, when there is a clear sky, there is no cloud, then 100% of the solar radiation reaches here, and only 5% is reflected by the sea water. So this actually confirms that the increased absorbed solar radiation, ASR, we have been talking about so far with respect to the sea ice concentration reduction, this is responsible for the reduction of clear sky is much larger than that of the total sky. So how much reduction actually takes place, we can actually compare here. So what we can say is, here if we look at 100% sunlight hitting the water, 95% of that is being absorbed and only 5% is reflected. So that means maximum amount is absorbed in this particular clear sky. When there is a cloud, what happens is it only receives now 80% of the solar radiation, again only 5% is being reflected. So that means if we subtract these two numbers, 80 minus 5, so only 75% is being absorbed by the sea water when there is a cloud. But here if we calculate 100 minus 5 is 95. So that means 95% of the solar radiation is being absorbed. So when higher solar radiation is absorbed, leads to heating of that water. So that is what we can understand from the clear sky and the cloudy sky. So let us look at the albedo effect and the climate change mechanisms. So there are two major pathways. One we are going to see now is the direct pathway. So in the direct pathway, we have the ice albedo feedback mechanism. So this ice albedo feedback mechanism actually leads to accelerated ice melt. That means if there are the albedo feedback is more, then it is actually going to lead to the melting of ice. So when we talk about ice albedo feedback, we know that if there are more ice, then obviously there are going to be more albedo effect. So that means less radiation will be absorbed by the water, and if the albedo is less, that will lead to accelerated ice melt, because now more and more sunlight is being absorbed by the ice. Then this leads to enhanced warming. So that is how the feedback mechanism actually works. Like more ice gets melt, then we get more water, the water absorbs more sunlight, so it gets heated up, so it leads to melting of more ice. So the feedback loop goes like that. And we also have ocean atmosphere interaction. So that means the atmosphere also has an effect, because when we calculate the near surface temperature, so just above the ocean also the temperature increases to a small amount. It is not only the sun rays just heating up the water, even the near surface is also getting heated up because of that. So this leads to a heat exchange between the aqueous and the gaseous conditions. That means the aqueous water and the gaseous atmosphere, there is a small heat exchange that happens, and this also modifies the circulation pattern. So that means when the temperature changes, obviously the pressure also getting changed. So that means the wind blowing direction also gets changed. We also have a indirect pathways. So the indirect pathway affects the carbon cycle, because if more and more sun rays hit the permafrost in the Arctic region, so the heat will be now absorbed by the soil, because the soil absorbs lots of heat. So that leads to melting of the permafrost. So thawing of the permafrost actually takes place. So that releases some amount of carbon dioxide. So that affects the CO2 carbon cycle. These also release methane and carbon dioxide. Both the gases are released by the thawing of permafrost. So that affects the carbon cycle. So this is an indirect mechanism. And then we also have ecological impact. For example, the habitat loss for polar species, because many of polar bears, seals and other things, they hunt on ice. So when there is no ice, they cannot hunt. So that means their habitat is getting reduced. So that leads to starvation for many of the polar species and other thing. When we study about later part, animal diversity and other thing, we will see little bit more on this one. How the decrease in the Arctic ice affects the food web of various Arctic species. And this also changes the biodiversity. So these are all the indirect effect of albedo on the climate change. Let us move on to the next one, which is the evapotranspiration. So evapotranspiration is a collective term used to describe the transfer of water from vascular plants, that is transpiration, and non-vascular plants and surfaces, that is evaporation, to the atmosphere. So water is getting released whether through the plant or through the surface. So that is what is the simple term. So loss of water is the only thing we are going to look at, and from where it actually is coming out. So the ET rate is normally expressed in millimeter or centimeter per unit time, and it is the second largest component of global water cycle after precipitation, because rain is the foremost important one in the global water cycle. So rain means it is coming from top to bottom, and when we talk about evapotranspiration means from the ground it is going up. So the transfer in the evapotranspiration, what happens is it is the release of gaseous water molecule. So that is what we have to mainly focus on. So what are the different components and the residence time we can look at. Water vapor has a residence time of a week. Rivers have a little bit longer duration. The water remains in river for maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Soil moisture remains between 2 weeks to 1 year. Fresh water in the Arctic Ocean is actually there for decades, and lakes and fjords, they are again, they have water for decades. Ice sheets and glaciers have water for thousands of years. So this is the approximate residence time of water in these kind of places. Let us look at the Arctic freshwater system. We have sources and sinks. These are all the two major things, but then the redistribution takes place between the source and the sink. So that is how the entire water cycle actually functions in the Arctic. So when we talk about source, what are the sources of water in the Arctic is basically through precipitation. Of course, Arctic has less rain compared to rest of the world, but then again precipitation is also one of the ways by which Arctic receives the water. Then river runoff is the next one. Ice sheet discharge and sea ice melt are the different ways by which Arctic receives the water. And the sinks are these waters actually from the rivers and ice sheets discharge leads to the oceanic inflow, because it may reach the Arctic Ocean, but from the Arctic Ocean it may again go to other oceans, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Oceans and other things. So that means it is being discharged. So it is actually ending up in the ocean. So that is the sink. And the sea ice growth is also possible. So once the water reaches the sea ice, it may lead to formation, because in the cold winter it may lead to the formation of ice. And also some of the water may be lost by evaporation. So how the redistribution takes place? The redistribution basically takes place between the Arctic basins, and the vertical mixing in the ocean is also possible, because we have fresh water reaching the Arctic Ocean and the saline water is at the bottom. So there is a vertical mixing of these two waters also takes place. So that is how the Arctic freshwater system gets redistribution of water. So this basically includes water in the solid, liquid and gas, all the three phases. So liquid is basically water, aqueous water, solid is the ice, gas is the water vapor. and it includes both lithosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere and atmosphere. So all the spheres are involved in the Arctic freshwater system. And let us look at what is evapotranspirations and the Arctic. So here, what are the sources and pathways of moisture that enter Arctic drainage basins? We know, we have seen earlier that Arctic is a desert. When it is a desert, there will be less water. So if there is less water, then where is the chance of precipitation? Rain cannot happen. So what are the sources and pathways of moisture that enters the Arctic drainage basin? That's what we have to see. Then again, is it possible to differentiate the various components that are included in the freshwater budget? That is precipitation. How much contribution comes from the precipitation? How much comes from the ocean and river inflows? And how much ice melt? How much glacier melt? So can we identify the portion of each contributors to the Arctic freshwater? Then if the freshwater budget is extremely complex and poorly understood, will it be easy to study about the evapotranspiration? Because evapotranspiration focuses on mainly two things, that is evaporation and transpiration. So only two things we are talking about. So how do we know if it is so complex? So this is the next question we have to answer. And basically the tundra landscape region has a long time worked as a sink because they sequestered a lot of carbon. But if the soil drying occurs, then there will be shift of tundra to a carbon source and thus causing a positive feedback. So that means so far the tundra were actually taking out the carbon dioxide and they were actually making the photosynthesis. So when that is actually happening, they are actually behaving like they are sequestering or removing the carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So they behave like a sink. But then if soil drying occurs, then what will happen is instead of the sink, now the land itself is going to release more carbon dioxide and methane. That's what we have seen in the indirect mechanism by which the albedo affects. So in the Arctic region. So that means this will lead to even more global warming. So this is a very negative effect of this albedo effect. And then atmospheric moisture, clouds and precipitation simultaneously affect and are affected by the rapid climate change in the Arctic. So this is both it affects and it is getting affected. Let us look at some of the Arctic freshwater sources. The increase in the greenhouse concentration actually leads to increase in the temperature. So we will be studying more about this Arctic amplification in the coming modules. So there this leads to melting of ice and precipitation in the northern high latitudes. Of course, North Atlantic deep water formation and the global thermohaline circulation is affected by. So this is what we have been talking about, the vertical mix of water, because the thermohaline is a little bit heavy, so it is at the bottom, and the fresh water enters from the Arctic is at the top. So there is a mix of these things happening. So that means the deep water formation and the thermohaline circulation is affected by the freshwater which are coming from the Arctic. And again, Arctic Ocean receives disproportionately large ratio of runoff to precipitation. So that means precipitation is less, runoff is more. That means melting of glaciers and melting of ice puts more water than precipitation. So moisture budget component include precipitation, evaporation, atmospheric moisture flux governance and runoff. So there are various components that are involved in the total Arctic freshwater sources. And here are some of the examples. So the freshwater ecosystems include lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, deltas and wetlands. These are all the different areas where we have the freshwater in the Arctic. The majority of Arctic lakes and the thermocrust lakes are formed within the depression left by thawed permafrost. So this is what we have been talking about, the ice albedo effect. So the permafrost thawing happens because more solar radiation is now reaching, because the ice covered top area soil is now melted because of more solar radiation. So that leads to melting of ice below the soil. So the permafrost leads to thawing. That leads to, because whatever is the ice at the bottom, now they form a small type of pond. So these are called the thermocrust lakes, and these are formed by the depression by the thawed permafrost. These small lakes are being formed, and these lakes are not permanent, and They are known and they are known to appear and disappear. Maybe this year we will be seeing that, next year it may be just disappearing. So these freshwaters, the thermocrust lakes, are temporarily present in the Arctic region. And let us look at how the climate change affects the Arctic freshwater system. So here is the overall things that is happening. This is very similar to what can happen in the normal tropical area also. So the warmer air temperature enables the atmosphere to hold more water, which leads to more precipitation in the Arctic. So that means if it is warm, it can hold more warm moisture. If it can hold more moisture, then there is a probability of cloud formation is more. When there is a probability of cloud formation is more, that leads to more precipitation. So this is how higher temperature leads to precipitation. Again, river flow and discharge from the melting glaciers and ice sheets are channeling growing volumes of fresh water into Arctic Ocean, because ice melts because of solar radiation. That ice water reaches the Arctic Ocean. So that is one of the main source for fresh water in the Arctic. So the river flow and the discharge of melting glaciers and ice sheets leads to increase in Arctic freshwaters. Then warmer surface temperature leads to thawing of permafrost and greater amount of transpiration from the plant. So this is what we have been talking about. The tundra forest is now becoming from a carbon sink to carbon source. They started releasing more carbon dioxide. So the thawing leads to more and more release of carbon dioxide and methane. So why it is a challenge to study the Arctic evapotranspiration? See, the main problem is Arctic is in the very north part of our globe. So that means remoteness of the research site, and the most field studies are relatively short duration because the winter is so severe. People cannot live there for a long time. So that is the reason we can only study for during some period of the year. Of course, now that lots of scientific activities are happening throughout the year, but still comparatively it is much less with respect to the rest of the areas in the world. And again, the instruments are the major problems because we have uncertainty due to wind effects near the gauge orifice. So if you are going to measure how much precipitation takes place, if there is a snow and the snow covered the orifice, that means then we cannot even measure how much water is actually being falling. That means how much is the precipitation we cannot see. So there are, again, wind may actually cover those areas. So that is also another problem. Difficulty in distinguishing falling snow and blowing snow, difference in gauge types. That's what. So snow as well as very melted snow. These are all the problems which will create the measurement of many of the instruments in the Arctic region. And another major problem is like there is no electricity at many places. So everything has to operate at battery. And again, the temperature is so low in those areas, the battery also stops functioning. So that means this is another biggest challenge to keep the instrument from running for longer time. So that is also a major problem here. And of course, measurement of precipitation, that is due to snow formation, and the runoff, that is presence of snow, ice, permafrost thawing, is difficult because we only see water is there. But how the water came? Is it the melting of the ice or it is from the precipitation? We have no idea. We cannot differentiate it. So this is another major problem we have. Then evaporation studies are labor intensive, requires frequent personal observation and hands-on data collection by the researcher. So this is also another challenge. The highly uncertain spatial heterogeneity, that means soil moisture, soil temperature and plant composition, and differences in polygonal geomorphology makes it difficult to extrapolate measurement from station to the entire region. So we have lots of fjords, valleys and mountains. So how do we extrapolate the data? We have some terrain, then we immediately have some mountains, then we immediately have some valleys. So that means that entire morphology is actually not a uniform one. So this also is a major challenge. We cannot simply extrapolate what happens here, then let us expand it to all the places. Is not possible in the Arctic region.